My big brother gutted me at that brunch table, his voice slicing through the chatter as he smirked, and bet $200 he'd steal my wife. Right in front of our buddies. His lottery cash gleaming like a weapon. Worse, she didn't flinch, she smirked back, sold me out for a promise of the world. Her words choking me as I stood there, unseen, the punchline of their cruel game. 7 months ago, that moment shattered everything. My trust, my marriage, my family. All torched in a haze of mimosas and laughter that still rings in my ears. He'd won over $1 million, not mega millions. But enough to turn him into a cocky stranger who thought money bought loyalty. I'd laughed it off, certain she'd never ditch me for that clown, but she did. Publicly. Brutally. Leaving me gasping as her friends giggled and his eyes glinted with triumph. The betrayal wasn't just her leaving, it was them stripping me bare, mocking me in plain sight. My hands shook. Coffee burned my tongue the next morning when divorce papers hit. But I swore I'd watch them crumble. That reckoning came, and I'd make damn sure they felt every splinter. Hey everyone, I'm Jake, 34 years old, and let me take you back to the day my life imploded. 7 months ago, when my big brother and my wife torched everything I'd built. Starting with a bet that ripped my marriage to shreds and left me cold. Grinning when their gilded world finally crashed. I'd always been the steady one, the guy who held it together after our parents died, who propped up my brother Keith through his failures, his messes, his secrets. Or what I thought were secrets. We grew up tight, 2 orphans against the world, and I married Sally thinking she'd be my rock too. She wasn't the type for luxury. Hated designer bags, laughed at excess. So when Keith won that lottery, over $1 million, I didn't blink. Money wouldn't sway her, I thought. How naive was I? That brunch flipped the script, exposing a truth I dodged. Everyone's got a price, and hers was cheaper than I'd ever dreamed. Looking back, it's a jagged scar across my life. Keith had always envied me. My stability, my wife. And I'd brushed it off, defending him even when he floundered. I'd hidden his split personality from the world. A burden I carried since we were teens, thinking it explained his chaos. Sally. I'd trusted her blind, built a future with her, planned to surprise her with news of my business taking off. But that day, they turned me into a fool, and I didn't see it coming. Keith's bet wasn't a joke, it was a blade, and she grabbed it, plunged it in, and twisted. If you can give me the world, I'm in, she'd said, smirking at me like I was nothing. I stood there, choking on disbelief, their laughter a noose tightening around my neck. 7 months later, when she came crawling back, begging for help, I didn't flinch. Her tears meant nothing after what they'd done. I'd waited for their fall, and when it hit, I savored every bitter drop. This isn't about guilt, it's about watching justice burn slow, and I'm not sorry. 7 months ago, that brunch was a slaughterhouse, and I was the lamb. We were at this trendy spot in town. Wooden tables, clinking glasses. Sunlight streaming through big windows. Me, Keith, Sally, and a few buddies from the old crew. Keith had just won the lottery, over $1 million, and he strutted in like a king. His new arrogance dripping off every word. We'd been joking around, beers in hand, when he leaned back, grinned at me, and said, "Bet you $200 I can steal your wife, Jake." The table erupted, laughter hoots like it was some dumb gag. I chuckled too, slapped his shoulder. "You're dreaming, man. She'd laugh you out the door." Sally rolled her eyes. Called him a clown. I was 100% sure she'd never bite. She wasn't about money, our love was deeper than that. Or so I'd convinced myself. Then it turned. Key's eyes narrowed, that cocky glint sharpening. "I'm serious," he said, pulling out his phone. "She leaves you, I'll clear her whole Amazon wishlist $3,000, right now." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, waiting for her to shut it down. She didn't. Sally leaned forward, smirk, "You're on. If you can give me the world, I'm in." The table went quiet, then exploded again. Friends laughing, thinking it's a roast. I choked, orange juice burning my throat, as Keith tapped his phone, sent the cash and said, "Don't divorce him, marry me. She'll live like a queen." She laughed. Light and cruel, mimosas got me wild, why not? I snapped. "Cut the crap, Sally. Cancel it." She scoffed. "Don't control me, Jake. If I want, I'll go." Keith grinned. "I'll take better care of her. Leave this loser." I wanted to deck him, wipe that smug look off his face, but her smirk stopped me cold. She meant it. Friends howled, slapping the table, oblivious to the blood draining from my face. I stood, voice low. "Meet me at the car." She didn't. I walked out, their laughter slicing my back, a public execution I couldn't unsee. That was the moment I lost her and him. And I'd never forgive either. Growing up, Keith and I were welded together by loss. Our parents gone in a car wreck when I was 15, him 17. Cleveland winters were brutal, but we had each other, 2 kids against a world that didn't care. I was the steady one. Good grades, odd jobs. While Keith floundered, a dreamer who couldn't land. People called him a loser, a clown, and I'd step in, fists clenched, defending him because he was my brother. Then came the diagnosis. Split personality disorder, Charlie taking over when Keith snapped. He'd blank out, do wild shit. Got kicked out of school once. And I'd cover for him, drag him to therapy, pay for meds when we could barely eat. We moved towns to escape the whispers, vowed to keep it buried. I thought it explained his chaos, his failures. Thought I was his lifeline. He'd always had a thing for Sally. Stupid puppy eyes at our wedding, flirty jabs I'd laugh off. I'd tell her, he's harmless, and she'd giggle, your brother's a mess. I believed it bonded us. Me protecting him, her choosing me. When he won that lottery, I was happy. Worried too, knowing he'd blow it chasing approval. But I didn't see the monster brewing. That brunch showed Med I'd been blind. He didn't just want her, he wanted to bury me, prove he could win. I'd spent years shielding him, blaming Charlie for his screw-ups, only to learn later it was a lie. He'd faked it, played me for sympathy while resenting my life. You had it all. He'd admit months later. Wife, stability, I had nothing. That betrayal wasn't just the bet, it was every time I'd carried him, every secret I'd kept, thrown back in my face. He wasn't my brother that day. He was my executioner, and I'd let him sharpen the axe. Sally and I weren't perfect, but I thought we were solid. Married 5 years. We'd built something real. Or so I'd convinced myself. She was a teacher, practical, laughed at my dumb jokes, didn't care for flash. Turned down a Louis Vuitton bag I'd saved for once, said, I'd rather have you. I believed her. We'd argue. Money tight, my business stalling. But we'd always patch it up, late nights on the couch, her head on my chest. Keith's lottery win didn't faze her, she'd shrug, good for him, doesn't change us. I'd grin, proud of her loyalty, blind to the cracks. That brunch morning, I'd planned to surprise her. My business had landed an investor, cash flowing soon. I pictured her face lighting up, us finally free. Instead, she traded me for a wish list. Looking back, I missed the signs. She'd nag about bills, roll her eyes when I worked late, but I thought it was stress, not greed. Keith's flirty jabs. She'd brush them off, call him a goof. But maybe she'd like the attention. I'd built her up in my head, loyal, grounded mine. That day, when she smirked, if you can give me the world, I'm in. It wasn't the mimosas. It was her price tag flashing neon. $3,000 to ditch me. I couldn't pull that out of thin air, not yet, but I'd been close. Hours from telling her our life was about to shift. She didn't wait. She saw Keith's cash, his promise, and jumped, leaving me choking on dust. I'd trusted her with everything, thought love trumped money. Turns out, I was the clown, betting on a woman who'd sell me out the second a better deal waved. After that brunch, I drove home alone, the car silent, her laughter still clawing my ears. I'd told her to meet me there. Waited an hour, engine idling, texting, calling, nothing. Friends' chuckles haunted me. Did they know? I pulled into our driveway, house dark, hoping she'd stumble in, blame the drinks. She didn't. Next morning, I woke to divorce papers on the counter. Coffee scalding my tongue as I stared at her signature. Clean final. She'd gone, marry Keith that fast, a courthouse job I found out later from a mutual friend's awkward text. I lost it. Called her, begged, screamed into voicemail she'd never answer. How could you? I'd yell, pacing our empty living room, her stuff already cleared out like I'd been erased. No note, no goodbye. Just gone. I couldn't face our parents. They were dead, no one to vent to, so I turned on Keith. Take it back. I roared over the phone, voice cracking, begging him to undo it. He laughed, sent me a Venmo request, $200, you lost the bet, bro. I signed those papers weeks later, pen shaking, but a cold smile crept up. I knew him. His spending, his chaos. That million wouldn't last. He'd blow it, and she'd see the mess she'd picked. I didn't warn her. Why bother? She'd chosen him, humiliated me in front of everyone. Her world a cheap thrill she'd regret. The house echoed with her absence. Her mug still in the sink, her scent fading from the couch. But I stopped chasing. That smile when I signed wasn't joy, it was knowing they'd crash. And I'd be miles away when the flames hit. Signing those divorce papers, I didn't cry. I smirked, a bitter edge cutting through the haze. Keith's lottery win was a ticking bomb. And I'd seen the fuse burning for years. He'd always been reckless. Blew cash on dumb schemes, chased approval like a drug. $1 million didn't change that, it just lit the match faster. I'd warned him once, pre-brunch, slow down man, you'll tank, and he'd sneered. You know nothing. Post-win, he'd morphed. Cocky, cruel, treating me like dirt under his new boots. I knew he'd overspend, drown in debt, and drag her with him. Sally. She'd bought the fantasy, blind to the cliff. I didn't stop it. Didn't care to. She'd picked him, let her ride that train wreck. I'd called it from day one. He'd flash cash, cars, trips, her wish list, until the well ran dry. No job, no plan, just a guy who thought money made him invincible. I'd lived with his chaos. Covered his rent, lied for him, thinking it was Charlie, his other half. Turns out, it was just Keith, a liar who'd played me. That brunch bet wasn't impulse. It was his shot to bury me, and she jumped in, greedy for the ride. I didn't warn her when I signed it. Let her figure out his world was a house of cards. 7 months later, when she messaged, panicked, I wasn't shocked. Bankrupt, broken, begging me to save her. I'd seen it coming, and I felt nothing. They'd torched me, now they'd burn. I leaned back, coffee cold, and waited for the inevitable. 7 months after she bolted, Sally crashed back into my inbox, her messages a frantic SOS. Jake, I'm sorry. Why didn't you warn me about him? She typed, words dripping with desperation. He's a mess, bankrupt, terrifying, I need out. I sat in my new house. Bought with my business boom, the one she'd mocked. Staring at my phone, her pleas lighting up the screen. She'd tracked me down, showed up at my gate one blistering afternoon, begging for hours until my soft heart cracked and let her in. I was wrong, she sobbed, perched on my couch, eyes hollow. He's not who I thought. Marriage was hell. Help me. I didn't move, didn't flinch. Her tears were ghosts of a past I'd buried. She spilled it all. Keith's spending spiraled, his sweet, mask slipping into rages she couldn't predict. He snapped one day, yelled, threw stuff. I saw someone else in him, she said, trembling. I knew that someone. Thought it was Charlie, his disorder, but later learned it was fake. She'd stayed, blinded by the cash, until his account hit negative, and reality bit. I didn't know, she whispered. You should have stopped me. Rage flickered. Stopped her, after she'd smirked, ditched me for $3,000. You chose him. I said, voice flat. In front of everyone, you laughed. She flinched. I was drunk, stupid. I loved you. Bullshit. I'd loved her, planned a future she trashed. Now she was stuck, scared, and I felt zero pull to save her. Figure it out, I said, showing her the door. Her betrayal had numbed me. She'd reap what she sowed. 3 months back, the mask fell. Keith wasn't broken, he was a fraud. Rumors hit he'd posted online, denying the split personality, claiming he'd been fine since 19. I tracked down the story. Someone screenshot it before it vanished. She's lying, I've got reports. He wrote, spinning a tale to dodge her smear campaign. I texted him, furious. What the hell? His replay gutted me. Episode stopped years ago. I kept it up so you'd care. You had it all. Wife life. I was the loser. Lottery fixed that. Taking her made me king. My phone slipped, hands shaking. He'd faked it, decades of therapy, meds, me shielding him. All a lie to leech my pity, my loyalty. Brunch wasn't a whim, it was revenge. Since our parents died, I'd carried him. Lied to townsfolk who shunned him. Paid his bills. Blamed Charlie for his flops. He'd resented me for it. Seed that I'd built something while he floundered. That $1 million flipped the switch. He didn't just want Sally, he wanted me crushed, a laughingstock. For once, I won. He'd typed. And I saw it every time I'd defended him, he'd hated me more. The disorder I'd mourned was a con. He'd played me, turned me into his fool. When she left him, debt piling, he blamed Charlie again. Sympathy bait. But she didn't buy it. Neither did I. I blocked him, rage boiling over. He wasn't my brother anymore. Just a stranger who'd stabbed me and twisted the knife for years. Their collapse was my canvas, and I painted it red. Sally's divorce dragged. Community property tied her to his debt. And she texted stressed, hinting she'd lean on me post-split. I didn't reply, but when the bank auctioned Keith's assets, I's Prime's car, black Mustang he'd bragged about, hit the block. I bought it, cash from my business, now thriving since she'd left. Then I staged it, picked her up, drove her around, snapped pin his car, her smiling, me stone-faced. Sent them to Keith. He lost it, called sobbing, you don't need this, I'm ruined. I didn't care. Feel it. I said, voice ice. You took her, now choke on this. He begged. Leave her, she's trouble. But I hung up. Blocked her too after the date. It was a lie. I'd never take her back. Just a jab to make him bleed like I had. That Mustang purred under me, a trophy of their ruin. Keith's calls kept coming. Texts about his life ending. But I deleted them, numb. Sally thought I'd softened, texted thanks, but I ghosted her. This wasn't forgiveness, it was vengeance. Cold and deliberate. They'd humiliated me. Her smirk, his bet, the public gut punch. And I'd waited for this. His debt, her panic, their crash. It wasn't enough, but it was close. I'd risen. Business booming, house mine. While they sank. Driving that car, I felt the weight lift, not joy. Just a hollow win. They'd pay forever, and I'd watch from afar, hands clean, heart sealed shut. 2 months ago, the endgame hit hard. A midnight call from the hospital. Keith and Sally, beaten bad, admitted with broken bones and bleeding faces. Some loan sharks he'd crossed. Promises he couldn't keep. Tracked them down, thought she was still his wife. I got there at dawn, corridors sterile, air thick with antiseptic. Keith took the dribs, internal bleeding. Comatose for days, then months of recovery. He woke, silent, refused my visits, left town without a word. No clue where he's limping off to, but his body's wrecked for life. Sally got it in the face. Bones smashed, weeks of surgery, still not the same. I was there when she saw the mirror, bandages off, her gasp echoing. What do I do now? She whispered, voice small. Money gone, Keith gone, me gone. I had no answer, just stood there blank. She healed, vanished. Works as a cleaner now, they say, in our town. But we never cross paths. Keith's silence lingers too, no apology, no trace. I'd tried reaching him, guilt flickering, but he'd shut me out. He'd faked that disorder, used it to dodge life. Stole my wife to prove a point. Then crashed hard. Her beating was karma, his was fate. I don't feel bad. Why should it me? And I'd let them burn. My house sits quiet now, success hollow without trust. I defended a lie, loved a traitor. Both paid, and I'm left standing, not whole, just alive. Indifferent, maybe cruel, but free. If kin carve you up for cash or spite, don't lift a finger when they fall. Let them drown in the muck they made, like I did with my brother and ex-wife. They slashed me open, traded me for a cheap thrill, and I owe them nothing. No pity. Rescue their betrayal's a fire, step back, watch it consume them, and build something they can't touch. I rose from their ashes. Business thriving, life mine. While they rot, broken and broke. Trust's a ghost now, but I don't need it to stand tall. Cut the ropes tying you to their mess, you're not their savior. They chose their hell. Let them lie in it. What's your story? Ever had family stab you like that? Drop it below. I'm curious how you'd play it. If this hit a nerve, pass it along to someone who gets it, or hang around. I've got more scars to share. Hit like if you're with me, maybe subscribe if you're into these raw cuts of life. Let's keep peeling back the layers, quiet but real.